Hello there, I'm Noel Hacegaba, Chief Operating Officer at the Port of Long Beach, and welcome to Supply Chain Insight, where we explore the latest trends, issues, and news in the supply chain with top industry leaders, experts, and influencers. Our objective is to bring you the insight you need to help you keep your cargo moving. Today's business executives expect a lot from their supply chains: efficiency, velocity, flexibility, cost management, and operational excellence. Supply Chain Insight brings the supply chain to you, one segment at a time, to explore new approaches and innovative solutions that will help you and the Port of Long Beach deliver greater value to our customers and partners. Today's episode looks ahead and answers the question, what's next for shipping? I think you would agree that the new normal is still evolving. Record volumes have been replaced by muted peaks and a retrenchment to pre-pandemic levels. What could this signal for the balance of the year and for 2024? Well, to help us answer those questions, our special guest today is a longtime partner and friend of the Port of Long Beach, Ken O'Brien. Ken is the CEO and president of Gemini Shippers Association, the transportation industry's leading cooperative procurement group, whose mission is to aid shipping companies in navigating the ever-changing marketplace by streamlining the process between quote request and shipment arrival, and by providing members with rate searching, tracking and tracing, and data analytic tools. Ken also serves as president of Blues Park. Blues Park delivers tech-enabled consulting, procurement, and logistics operations services to shippers and shipper associations. Now, prior to joining Gemini, Ken served as a founder of Big Box, Small Box, an analytics consulting and SaaS firm which merged to form Orion Capital Group. Prior to that, Ken spent over 20 years in the liner shipping industry with APL and Hapag-Lloyd, where he held various senior trade management and operating roles, culminating in management of APL's Trans-Pacific P&L as Senior Vice President of the Trans-Pacific Trade. Ken received his bachelor's degree in maritime administration from Texas A&M. He also earned a master's degree in business analytics from the Stern School of Business at NYU, and also a master's degree in homeland and cybersecurity from Farley Dickinson University. Ken serves as vice chairman of the FMC's National Shippers Advisory Committee, and in 2022, he was nominated to serve in the Biden-Harris administration's Freight Logistics Optimization Works, or FLOW, program, which is administered by the Department of Transportation. Ken, welcome to Supply Chain Insight. It's good to have you on the show, on the set, in person today, and I know you and I have frequent conversations about the goings-on in our industry, but it's nice to be able to have this conversation in front of our viewing audience.
And so in the same room.
And in the same room, exactly. So let's start with the obvious question. What's the state of shipping, and what keeps you up at night these days?
It's a great question. First and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation. On behalf of Gemini's 300 member companies, a great honor to be here, and look forward to our talk. You know, I think the core issues, is, change being the constant. And really the shippers ultimately having this constant, and not just the shippers, obviously the provider side as well for the shipping industry, this constant change month after month and having to continually try and adapt to the unknown. And so I think for most of them, there is a piece of atrophy. I mean, it's gotten hard. The other thing, all of these exogenous forces that affect shippers that are things outside their control, they can't predict, can somewhat plan for, but really have to think about. And if you think about where we are today, everyone's come back from COVID. There's this large run up in volume. Obviously, it's tailed down. The numbers, every part of the supply chain shows the same trend. A changing and somewhat fickle consumer, a move to e-com, services over goods. And so for someone who is importing or exporting something, how do I forecast against a baseline that I really have to jump all the way back to 2019, and and almost take away the last 2.5 years, which just don't really fit the trend line today.
As usual, Ken, you hit it spot on. It's like chasing a moving target, right? So in light of everything you just said about the current state of shipping in the market, what is your outlook for the rest of this year and looking ahead into the first half of 2024?
Yeah, so the magic 8 ball sometimes is a little cloudy. I mean, you have to admit, it's
Sometimes.
it's a hard read. But you know what we can see, and what our members, and we're very lucky to have a member base of really interesting companies in lots of verticals. And so we can really get a good kind of look at different segments of the economy through our members' lens. But all of them are pretty low. I mean, at the end of the day, we can start to see purchase orders and commitments forward. I think our peak is over. I think realistically we've kind of hit, peak volumes for the year. There'll be little pops up and down, I think. But I think realistically, what we have is what we have for now. And, and in the context of 20 to 22, that's not a great answer. In the context of 2019, it's really not as bad as people would think. And so I think it's all that context of, how do I, where am I and where did I start? But we don't really see any signal that says there's this material reason to have change, certainly up into the first quarter. And I think you could argue when you look at interest rates, credit cards, home starts, that there's not really a great demand signal that says in 24 there's a major paradigm change. So I think we are where we are. It's not the worst place we've ever been. And so probably we have to get comfortable and build supply chain, our network side, around this is kind of the going concern and how we'll be.
You're validating a lot of what we're seeing here in Long Beach, Ken. When you look at our cargo volumes year to date in 2023, we're about 26, 27% behind last year, and even further back behind 2021, which is our all-time high. But interestingly, we're tracking almost identically with 2019. So one could say we're regressing to pre-pandemic levels. But what you said earlier about some of these exogenous factors, when you look at all the traditional indicators that have used historically to forecast what's coming, they're all mixed. And it's really hard to discern what's coming. So I want to shift now to something you alluded to earlier. What are some of the trends that you're seeing emerging or taking shape in the near future? I mean, nearshoring, for example, keeps getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of buzz behind that. Are you seeing any significant shifts?
And I think there's a couple. Certainly more e-com-centric direct-to-consumer spend exists. More, that trend moving to service. But when we say trend moving to service, it's very easy to say, okay, wow, that must be all bad for containerization. Well, no. I mean, if I'm going on a cruise, I still need a bathing suit. But maybe I don't need a TV set. And so there again, which segments within imports are going up or down may change. I don't think it's just an overall macro, everything goes down. And I think a lot of people want that kind of headline story that doom, it's not there. I think the other part is there are some shifts going on that started pre-COVID that maybe COVID has accelerated or exacerbated. So something I'm sure keeps you up at night. The move to the East and Gulf Coast, right? Why has that happened? Will it stay? Will it revert? I think that's a real thing. The amount of cargo going intermodal, that's a real thing. And some of that changed during COVID and potentially doesn't come back quite as quick. And so are we changing from intact intermodal to truckload or consol and deconsol models? I think those are some of the trends. On the sourcing side, this shift, there's a lot of talk about the shift out of China. And so certainly China has lost share of total TP imports. I think the data shows it. But when you really think about it, China is still an amazingly important trading partner. I don't think that'll change in our lifetimes, most likely. But a 1% drop in China put in other countries is a really big story. Then last but not least, you hit on it, nearshoring. I think this is an amazing piece. You could argue, and some will argue, I think, with us, that if it hasn't happened yet, maybe it won't. But when you really look at the number of trucks and trains coming over the Mexico-US border every day, it is an amazingly important trading partner, now our biggest. And I think there are certainly reasons why there are challenges. The electric grid in Mexico is a challenge. The oil industry is a challenge to make that electric grid. There are some security things. I think those are real problems. But it's illogical to think that won't continue to grow. It's a great gateway, and I think most firms are putting more emphasis on trying to figure it out. But I don't think it's a light switch sort of thing.
I would agree with you on that, Ken. In fact, when we went through the 2018-2019 U.S.-China trade dispute, obviously we were disproportionately impacted here on the West Coast. And when 70% of your business is with one country, even if that shift accelerates, it's not going to shift overnight. I mean, this is, what we have today is decades in the making.
Right.
Now, having said that, like you said, a lot of shippers have started shifting their manufacturing away for a variety of different reasons. I was in Mexico recently as part of a Port of Long Beach delegation and was surprised to see how much interest Mexico is getting as an emerging hub for logistics. And nearshoring is at the forefront. And you see a lot of activity, and you've seen a lot of activity for decades now. The Maquiladora is just south of the border. Sure. But when you consider 35,000 trucks that cross the U.S.-Mexico border, and you consider that Mexico emerged earlier this year as the United States' largest trade partner, it just signals that maybe this might be the time.
There's a there there.
Right? There's a there there.
Yep.
So I appreciate your insight on that. Let's shift to the liner shipping industry, which is another segment that you're very familiar with.
Indeed.
So Maersk and MSC have already announced that the 2M alliance will come to an end in 2025. Separately, HMM is in the process of selling a controlling interest. And earlier this year, there was some speculation that perhaps Hapag-Lloyd and the O&E might be candidates for a merger, right? Do you see these things as signals of a broader realignment in the liner shipping industry? Or what do you think this means, and what do you think this means for shippers?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, if you think of since 2016, 6 M&A transactions and a bankruptcy. And so this is an industry that continues to move in a consolidation mode. Bigger carriers. When I left the liner shipping industry in 2016, came to the other side of the table, the company that I worked at would be infinitely small today. These companies gotten much bigger, much more complex. The assets required to run them, human capital. And so these alliance structures make sense. But I think, the truth is they are not permanent. They're not designed to be permanent, and things change and partners will change. And so I think the 2M has worked well for both carriers. I think they both benefit from it. I think their customers, I think we benefited from it. But they've decided both to take a different path, and that will potentially lead to some knock-on, other changes out there. I don't know. But I think whatever it is, liner companies, want to serve their customers with a good product that covers all their needs. And so as long as there's freight, I think that the liner industry will find ways to meet the need. Maybe different partners. Some of that might feel better or worse, I suppose. But I think history has said, when I first started, in 1993, all those alliances and carriers, most of them don't exist today. And so we're still here and we're still plugging along. And so hard to say where it goes, what MSC, the path they take. They seem to be going the path of more VSAs. Maersk, not so sure. It sounds like they maybe want to run their network and have more control. I think there's benefits to both. Sure. And so I think they'll have to figure it out.
So it doesn't sound like we're going to have a scenario similar to what we saw in 2016, where we had the 6 mergers and a bankruptcy, where someone suggested 6 marriages and a funeral. But that being the case, what I'm hearing from you is that the carriers will do what the carriers must do, right? Yeah. To stay afloat and keep their lines of business going.
Yeah, these are hard businesses. I think at the end of the day, it's easier for shippers to say, the carriers have just made a lot of money, and so this is great. There were decades where they didn't, and the capital investment. And when you look at the future, the CapEx, as you get into the decarbonization story,
that's right,
massive sums. And so I think, as shippers, we have to be practical. Our willingness to pay has to meet their ability to provide, right? And those have to at some point align. Alliance is one way they do to give one company the breadth and depth of service that I, as a shipper or a company who represents shippers, is asking for.
That's right. So when you're in an industry where you're asset high and asset heavy, in the same industry where the shipper is constantly saying, hey, we want you to reduce your rates, it creates that tension.
It's tough.
Let's shift gears to disruption, right? So another word, if we were to define our industry, certainly in recent years, I think one word you could use to describe it is disruption. Let me get your thoughts on the latest disruption in the global supply chain. The Panama Canal. as we all know, has been impacted by a severe drought, and the result of that is reduced capacity and vessel backlogs. Now, recent history reminds us, Ken, that disruption anywhere in the supply chain will eventually reach the entire global supply chain. In this case, when a trade route that facilitates 80% of global trade experiences disruption, the entire global supply chain will feel it eventually. So how do you see this disruption in Panama impacting trade in the U.S. market?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly I can remember earlier in my career, I was on the maritime side and the operating side. You know, it's not new to have the Panama Canal have draft issues. I think since they've enlarged the canal, that certainly has gotten worse, right? Those ships are bigger, they're deeper, they take more water. And of course, Panama, they have a rainy season. Mm-hmm. The effects of El Nino are real, global warming is real, climate change is real. And so there will be times of the year where that just is a problem. I think we're lucky in that the liner industry has been less affected than the bulk and the tanker side, but it's still real. I think the good news, bad news. I think the good news is when you look at the East Coast and Gulf all-water loops, you know, a very large proportion is still Suez-based, and so there is some ability. And so the Suez, of course, not being a canal with locks,
right,
this issue doesn't impact it. And so we are seeing some ships coming through late. It is happening, of course. The Suez networks are still running as is. And so carriers will have to think about that, right? You know, is there a risk reward? You know, of course, it's where's the cargo coming from, sea distance, steaming time, maybe a little longer transit time, but de-risking might make some sense. It's also something that's not going to be 12 months a year every year.
Right.
And so hopefully, you know, we're all praying for rain, and you know, this will work itself out. But I do think this is probably, you know, where I think, you know, everything we read and understand, this is months more of this that we're going to have to endure.
You know, this brings up another issue, right? The drought in Panama is another reminder about the impacts of climate change. Earlier this year, Gemini Shippers Group announced a strategic partnership with Greenable, which enables shippers to incorporate their transportation activities, consider the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., into broader sustainability efforts. So tell us a little bit about that, and what's the status, and where do you see this partnership with Greenable going?
You know, I couldn't be more thankful for you to answer. It's something that really means a lot to me personally and our company and our members. So Greenable really was developed with the simple idea that shippers and carriers, all service providers, need to start working together on this solution. And so I think it's very noble of all of us to say, by 2050, I'll be net zero, and that's great. And without goals, you don't usually achieve a lot. And so, but that's a goal. We need to turn it into action. And so I think one thing that has really been a struggle is, right now, of course, the technology is not quite clear. Is it LNG or methanol or ammonia? There's a lot of questions. You know, in the trucking side, there's questions. Is it hydrogen or is it electric? I think those are real, and this is going to evolve over time. Yeah. What Greenable's goal was really to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
That's right.
And there needed to be one unified way, in my opinion, that shippers could come and say, well, what is the greenhouse gas impact of this container, and then find ways to ultimately mitigate it, and in the absence of mitigate it, offset it potentially. I think there's a unfortunate reality that the solutions we have today available to us don't meet the need. And so where would offsets fit in? And so Greenable was built really to be that one neutral place where both sides can come and have an honest, transparent discussion to see how we collectively can work towards a solution.
You know, Ken, it just makes a lot of sense to me personally, and I can tell you that here in Long Beach, we're proud of our resume. And that dates back to 2005 when our then Board of Harbor Commissioners made that bold declaration that we wanted to be a green port. And when you look at how far we've gotten, at the same time that our volumes have increased 40%, every category of pollution has been reduced drastically. So I like where you're going with this. I definitely want to hear about how that goes going forward, because I think it makes a ton of sense to start looking at things holistically and have one single way to capture that data.
Yeah. You know, I'll say the worst thing that could happen as we start to think about decarbonization as a surcharge.
That's right.
That's terrible. And
Agreed.
it's where our minds typically go, I think, in this. There's an issue, and then there's a cost. There is a cost, and shippers have to get comfortable that some of that cost has to be borne by freight. It just does. And so we still have to do the work, and I think this is a way to try and make it equitable. And I think if it's transparent, people will feel better writing that check than if it doesn't feel transparent. And so I think transparency and communication, it solves so many problems, and generally we're not that good at it.
No, it's well said, and as my economics professor used to tell us, no such thing as a free lunch, right? If you don't pay the cost, eventually you'll pay for it in some other way. So that brings us to our next question. I've long maintained that efficiency and sustainability are two sides of the same coin. Efficiency and optimization can help us reach our sustainability goals. They can also help us address some of the challenges facing our industry. For example, you serve on the FMC's National Shipper Advisory Committee, as well as the Department of Transportation's Flow Project. Tell us about your participation in these initiatives and what you see coming out of these efforts.
Yeah, as someone who's never worked in government and certainly have spent time with the FMC over my career, wasn't really sure what we were getting into and how it would go. Two very different products and projects. But I'm happy to say, I think the flow is really about if you can combine data from disparate sources in a neutral way, an anonymized way, how can we draw insight and inference? And so I think of it, my own way of describing it is, it's almost the hurricane forecast for freight. Right. And it's amazing what you can tease out of data. I think it's really, the power of large data sets and good analysis. And I think the team at DOT, I can't say how impressed I am with their level of technical acumen. They're wildly accomplished. I think, the National Shippers Advisory Council, a little different. That's about trying to, we're there as a group, 24 companies, split between import and export, to try and help and advise the FMC on where the state of freight is, a shipper's point of view. And so that one's a little different. It can be a little more contentious. We are making recommendations that ultimately can turn into regulation or rules. I think, again, though, the most important part of that, I think most of us would say the goal is not regulation. I think carriers and providers would say it. I think shippers too. The way around that's communication. Sometimes that communication has broken down in the past. I hope this is a way to actually say, let's talk more, and we won't need those regulations.
That's right. And I'm just really glad that they have folks with your pedigree on these committees, because everyone coming together, right? We're better together. We are a system of systems, and to the extent that you can bring everyone together to address some of these issues head on, I think we all benefit.
Yes.
And I would like to add our kudos to the Federal Maritime Commission, who's been a stalwart in convening these working groups and bringing these issues to bear, and appreciate certainly your service, as well as the Department of Transportation. This Flow initiative, we're proud to be part of that as well. Yes. I think you described it very well. I call it an early warning system. You call it a hurricane, and as we just went through a supply chain crisis of historic proportions, I think that's probably a better descriptor.
Felt that way.
But yeah, DOT and our federal partners have really stepped up in helping the industry create those forums where we could address these things. And I want a quick shout out to Andrew Peterson, who is leading the Flow initiative and also leading the multimodal office. So I want to end with a question that I'm sure is on the minds of all of our viewers and our shippers in particular. And that is, we keep talking about the new normal. I'm not sure we're there yet, but I want to get your thoughts. How would you describe the new normal? And how would you advise, or what advice would you give to those shippers who are watching this episode right now on how they could adjust, pivot, prepare for that new normal?
Sure. So the new normal might look like the old normal. It's a little, and I think the best way we try and prepare ourselves, help our members prepare, ultimately is information asymmetry is a real thing. Some people know more than others. I hope that we could always be the group that knows more. And so how do you do that? Never stop learning, right? We spend an inordinate amount of time learning and researching and talking and meeting with supply chain partners so that we have that knowledge base. I think the other part is you got to build your partnerships. I don't think you buy the fire extinguisher the day after the fire. That tends not to work too well.
If you can find them, too.
If you can find them. And so for us, building strong partnerships is really important. And Gemini has a long history of working with ports and carriers and trucking companies and railroads and trying to understand the dynamics of the market ahead of time so that when we see something that's not quite working, we're there. And then the last part, I think, is really, if COVID has taught us anything, it's that, this interconnected ecosystem, to your point before about Panama, something presses here and it's that whack-a-mole, it pops up here. And so resiliency and having that pre-built. And so, to use a sports, you would never go into a football game without a playbook.
That's right.
It doesn't mean you're going to run every play in that playbook, but it's there. And if you see something, you call a different play. Same thing, we don't write the playbook the day of the game, and so because we have to practice. And so I think that resiliency in the supply chain really requires you to think through, if this happens, I might do this. If this happens, I might do that. But you also have to understand, I think at the end of the day, some things you just have to deal with. And so then really as for importers and exporters, how do we build safety stock? How do we know what SKUs you have a little bit more lead time on? How do we diversify sourcing? There's a lot outside of the supply chain where we really, I think our goal is, and our responsibility is to inform these companies of what are those real realities so that they can build that into sourcing and production, lead times, their sales contracts with their customers. We can't expect them to know that. And so the only way we can help is to say, here's the landscape, and now build your network around the reality, right?
Yeah, very, very smart and very well articulated, Ken.
Thank you.
By the way, since you brought up the playbook, to our viewing audience, this is not the same Ken O'Brien who previously played for the New York Jets. But Ken, thanks again for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. We covered a lot, and our viewers received a lot of great insight. To our viewing audience, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again soon for another episode of Supply Chain Insight, brought to you by the Port of Choice, the Port of Long Beach.